Hi, Reddit. For 10 years, my marriage to Lisa felt solid, even unshakable. We were the kind of couple people admired, partners in every sense of the word. Our life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, built on a foundation of trust, laughter, and shared dreams. Or at least, that's what I believed. It started subtly, as these things often do. At first, it was the phone, always glued to her hand, her smile fading when I walked into the room. I told myself it was nothing, that I was imagining things. After all, Lisa was busy with work, constantly juggling deadlines and meetings. The late nights and hushed phone calls could easily be explained. But doubt has a way of planting itself deep, growing in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, I noticed her phone buzz. She glanced at it quickly, her lips curling into a smile before she set it down face down on the coffee table. My chest tightened. Who had made her smile like that? I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself I was overreacting. After all, we'd been married for a decade. If there was one thing I could count on, it was her loyalty. But the unease didn't go away. It followed me, a shadow I couldn't shake. I began to notice other things, her sudden interest in staying out late, the way she seemed distant even when we were in the same room. I wanted to ask her about it, to confront the sinking feeling in my gut, but I didn't. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Or maybe I just didn't want to believe that the woman I loved could be hiding something from me. Everything came crashing down one Thursday evening. Lisa had left for what she called a work dinner, her excuse as casual as always. I stayed home, flipping through TV channels and trying not to think about the growing distance between us. That's when my phone buzzed, a notification from a mutual friend, Mark. It was a photo. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Lisa was there, sitting at a dimly lit restaurant, but the man across from her wasn't a colleague. He wasn't someone I recognized at all. They were laughing, their heads close together, their body language unmistakable. The caption read, "Saw Lisa tonight. Didn't know you were out of town?" My blood ran cold. I stared at the photo, my mind racing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something I could explain away. Lisa wasn't at a work dinner. She was on a date. I sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of the realization pressing down on me. Every moment we'd shared, every promise we'd made, suddenly felt like a lie. I wanted to call her, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I saved the photo and decided to wait. If she was going to betray me, I wanted to catch her in the act. The next few days were a blur. Lisa acted as though nothing had happened, her smile as bright as ever, her voice light and cheerful. It made me sick. How could she sit across from me at breakfast, ask about my day, kiss me goodnight, all while carrying on with someone else? I began to pay closer attention, watching for clues. Her phone buzzed constantly, and she always found an excuse to leave the room before answering it. She started dressing up more for her work meetings, spending extra time on her hair and makeup. The lies were piling up, and I was determined to find the truth. Finally, the opportunity came. Lisa told me she had another late meeting, and this time, I followed her. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, my heart pounding with every turn she took. She pulled into the parking lot of a fancy downtown restaurant, the kind of place we used to go for anniversaries. I watched as she got out of the car, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the window. Then, a man appeared, tall, confident, and completely unfamiliar. They hugged, and my stomach churned. I parked and sat there for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Lisa and this man walked into the restaurant together, their hands brushing as they laughed at something I couldn't hear. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had built a life with, was sitting across from another man, sharing the kind of intimacy that was supposed to be reserved for me. I wanted to storm in, to confront them, to demand answers. But I held back. I needed a plan, something more deliberate than an impulsive outburst. If Lisa was going to betray me, she was going to feel the full weight of what she'd done. I wasn't just going to catch her in the act. I was going to make her face the consequences. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with possibilities. The anger burned hot in my chest, but beneath it was a deep, aching sadness. How had we come to this? How had the love we once shared turned into this tangled web of lies and betrayal? By the time I pulled into the driveway, I had made up my mind. The next time Lisa went to meet him, I would be ready. She thought she was clever, that her lies would go unnoticed. But she had underestimated me, and soon, she would realize just how wrong she was. I barely slept that night. The image of Lisa laughing with that man played on a loop in my mind, each replay more painful than the last. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. How had we come to this? How had I been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd shared a decade of my life with, had become a stranger. By the time morning came, I was more resolute than ever. This wasn't just about catching her in the act. It was about making her feel the weight of her betrayal. She had taken something sacred, something we had built together, and thrown it away like it meant nothing. If she thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was sorely mistaken. The next few days were torturous. I went through the motions of daily life, pretending everything was fine while secretly gathering my strength for what was to come. Lisa, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, continued her charade. She smiled, laughed, and kissed me goodbye each morning as though nothing had changed. It made my stomach turn. I decided to wait for the perfect moment. If she had a pattern, I needed to figure it out. I started paying closer attention to her behavior, her excuses, and her schedule. It didn't take long to notice a trend: Thursday evenings. She always had some meeting or work dinner that kept her out late. And judging by the photo Mark had sent me, Thursday was her night with him. The next Thursday, she played her part to perfection. Over dinner, she casually mentioned that she'd be working late again. "It's just this project," she said, twirling her fork in her pasta. "I promise, once it's done, things will calm down." I nodded, keeping my face neutral. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I know how busy you've been." She reached across the table, her hand brushing mine. "Thanks for understanding, Ethan. I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony nearly made me laugh. Instead, I squeezed her hand and said, "I just want you to be happy." If she noticed the edge in my voice, she didn't let it show. That evening, as she got ready, I watched her from the doorway. She was humming to herself, carefully applying her makeup and adjusting her dress. It was one of her nicer ones, the kind she used to wear for special occasions. The sight of her standing there, so radiant and confident, made my chest ache. How many times had I looked at her like this, filled with love and admiration? And now, all I could feel was a deep, searing betrayal. "Do I look okay?" she asked, turning to face me. "You look beautiful," I said, and for a moment, I hated how much I meant it. She smiled, kissed me on the cheek, and said she'd be back late. As soon as the door closed behind her, I grabbed my keys and followed. This time, I was ready. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I trailed her car. She drove downtown, parking in the same lot as before. I watched as she stepped out, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the window. Moments later, he appeared, James. They embraced, and I felt my blood boil. They walked into the restaurant together, laughing and talking as though they didn't have a care in the world. I parked a few spaces away and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I stepped out of the car and walked into the restaurant, my heart pounding in my chest. The hostess greeted me with a polite smile, but I barely registered her words. My eyes scanned the room until I found them, seated at a small table in the corner, their heads close together. They hadn't noticed me yet. I approached the bar and ordered a drink, my hands surprisingly steady. As I sipped my whiskey, I spotted a young waiter moving between tables. He looked nervous, like he was still getting the hang of the job. "Perfect." I motioned for him to come over. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I need you to do me a favor." The waiter frowned, clearly confused. "Sure. What do you need?" I pulled off my wedding ring and placed it in his hand. "Take this to the woman at that table," I said, nodding toward Lisa and James. "The one in the blue dress. Don't say anything. Just give it to her." The waiter stared at me, his eyes wide. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I said firmly. Trust me. It'll make sense. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and walked toward their table. I watched as he approached, the ring glinting in his hand under the soft light of the chandeliers. My heart pounded as I waited, anticipation and anger warring within me. This was it, the moment of truth. Lisa looked up as the waiter stopped beside her. She frowned, clearly confused, as he handed her the ring. For a moment, she just stared at it, as though she couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. Then her face went pale, her eyes darting around the room until they landed on me. I raised my glass in a silent toast, a cold smile on my lips. The color drained from her face as she realized what was happening. James, oblivious to the significance of the ring, looked between us, his confusion quickly turning to discomfort. Lisa stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you doing here?" I set my glass down and walked over to their table, my steps measured and deliberate. The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent, all eyes on us. I didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see what betrayal looks like. "What am I doing here?" I said, my voice calm but cold. "I think the better question is, what are you doing here, Lisa?" Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She looked at James, then back at me, her eyes wide with panic. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had the upper hand, and I wasn't about to let it go. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Lisa stood frozen, her mouth slightly open as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly realizing he was in the middle of something far more serious than a casual dinner date. I stood there, calm on the surface, but inside, my emotions churned like a storm. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment she couldn't deny what she'd done. "Well?" I asked, my voice low but sharp. "I'm waiting." Lisa's eyes darted around the room, probably trying to gauge how many people were watching. Most of the diners had turned their attention toward us, their conversations now a distant murmur. She looked back at me, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. "Ethan," she began, her voice weak. I can explain." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "Explain? Please, Lisa, enlighten me. What exactly do you plan to explain? The lies? The nights you spent with him while telling me you were working? Or maybe you'd like to start with how you thought you could get away with this." James stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Look, man, I don't think this is the place. Sit down," I snapped, my gaze locking onto him. He froze for a moment, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat, his face flushed with embarrassment. Lisa reached out as if to touch my arm, but I stepped back, making it clear I wanted no part of her theatrics. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice breaking. "Let's not do this here." I tilted my head, pretending to consider her words. "Oh, you're worried about the audience now? You weren't worried about that when you walked in here with him." "Don't worry, Lisa. I'm not here to make a scene. I just thought you might like your ring back since you clearly don't value what it stands for." Her eyes filled with tears as she glanced down at the ring in her hand. "Ethan, it's not what you think." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice firm. "Don't insult me by pretending this is something it's not. I saw the texts, Lisa. I've seen enough to know exactly what this is." James shifted in his seat again, looking like he wanted to disappear. I turned my attention to him, my tone colder than ice. "And you? Do you have anything to say? Or are you just going to sit there and let her take the heat?" He stammered for a moment, clearly caught off guard. I didn't know she was married." Another humorless laugh escaped me. "Really? You didn't notice the ring? Or the fact that she always had to sneak around to meet you? You're either a liar or an idiot, and I'm not sure which is worse." Lisa flinched at my words, but I didn't care. I wasn't here to spare her feelings. This was her mess, and I was done cleaning up after her. "You can both enjoy your dinner," I said finally, stepping back from the table, "but don't expect to see me at home tonight, or any night after this." "Ethan, wait," Lisa called after me, but I was already walking away, the weight of the confrontation lifting slightly as I left the restaurant. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Her silence and the shock on James's face told me everything I needed to know. I stepped out into the cold night air, my hands trembling as I shoved them into my pockets. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation was fading, replaced by an overwhelming wave of exhaustion and sadness. The world outside the restaurant felt quiet, almost too quiet, as though it didn't know what had just happened inside. I walked to my car, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the nearly empty parking lot. Sliding into the driver's seat, I let out a shaky breath and gripped the steering wheel, staring blankly ahead. My chest felt heavy, my mind replaying every word, every moment of that encounter. I'd confronted her, yes, but nothing about it felt satisfying. There was no sense of closure, no relief, just pain. I sat there for a while, unsure of what to do next. My house, the home we'd built together, no longer felt like a refuge. The thought of walking back through those doors, knowing she would be there, was unbearable. I couldn't face her right now. I couldn't face the memories of the life we had built, now tainted by her betrayal. Reaching for my phone, I scrolled through my contacts until I found Mark's name. He was the one who had unknowingly exposed Lisa's affair, and right now, he was the only person I trusted. I hesitated for a moment before hitting the call button. "Ethan?" Mark's voice was casual at first, but then it shifted to concern. "Hey man, everything okay?" "Not really," I admitted, my voice hoarse. "Can I come over?" "Of course," he said without hesitation. "I'll put on a pot of coffee. Just come straight here." Mark lived about 20 minutes away, and the drive felt surreal. My thoughts raced, jumping between anger, sadness, and confusion. How had things gone so wrong? What had I missed? I'd always thought Lisa and I were solid, that our love was unshakable. But clearly, I'd been wrong. When I arrived at Mark's place, he opened the door before I could even knock. He took one look at me and frowned. "Ethan, you look like hell." "Thanks," I muttered, stepping inside. The warmth of his home was a stark contrast to the cold emptiness I felt inside. "Sorry to drop in like this." "Don't apologize," he said firmly, leading me to the living room. "Sit down and tell me what's going on." I sank into the couch, running a hand through my hair. For a moment, I didn't know where to start. How do you explain that your entire life has been turned upside down? That the person you trusted most had been lying to you for months, maybe longer? Finally, I took a deep breath and told him everything. The texts, the photo he'd sent me, the confrontation at the restaurant. Mark listened silently, his expression growing darker with every word. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he admitted. "I'm sorry. I had no idea things were like this." "Neither did I said bitterly. "I feel like an idiot. How did I not see it?" Mark leaned forward, his voice firm. "Don't do that to yourself. This isn't on you. Lisa made her choices, and she's the one who screwed up, not you." I nodded, though his words didn't bring much comfort. "I don't know what to do now," I admitted. "I can't go back there. Not tonight." "Then don't," he said simply. "You can crash here. Take some time to figure things out." "Thanks, Mark," I said quietly. "I appreciate it." He patted my shoulder. "That's what friends are for. Now, let me get you that coffee." That night, as I lay on Mark's couch staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything finally hit me. I couldn't avoid it anymore. Lisa had betrayed me, and there was no undoing that. But what came next? Could I forgive her? Did I even want to? I didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. My life would never be the same. The next morning, the sunlight streaming through the window was an unwelcome reminder that the world continued to move forward, even when mine felt like it had come to a screeching halt. I sat up on Mark's couch, my head pounding from the restless night. The events of the previous evening played on a loop in my mind, each memory sharper than the last. Mark was already in the kitchen when I stumbled in, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air. He glanced up from his mug and gave me a sympathetic nod. "Rough night?" "You could say that," I muttered, grabbing a cup and sitting down at the table. The warmth of the coffee was comforting, but it did little to ease the ache in my chest. "Have you thought about what you're going to do next?" he asked, cutting straight to the point. I stared into my coffee, the question hanging heavily between us. Not really. I can't go back there, not yet. But I can't avoid it forever either. Emily's at school, and I'm sure Lisa's expecting me to come home at some point. Mark leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You don't owe her anything, Ethan. She's the one who screwed up. Take as much time as you need. I know, I said quietly, but it's not just about her. It's about what's next. Do I try to fix things? Do I leave? What happens to everything we've built? He sighed, shaking his head. That's a tough call, man. But whatever you decide, just make sure it's what's best for you. Don't let her manipulate you into thinking this is somehow your fault. I nodded, appreciating his support more than I could put into words. Thanks, Mark. I needed to hear that. By the time I left his house, I had a little more clarity, though my heart still felt like it was caught in a vice. I needed answers, more than what I'd gotten at the restaurant. If Lisa wanted to salvage any part of what we had, she owed me the full truth. No excuses, no half-truths. Everything. The drive home felt longer than usual, every mile filled with a mixture of dread and determination. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the house. It looked the same as always, peaceful, welcoming. But I knew the truth now. It was just a facade, hiding the lies that had been building for months. I walked through the front door, and there she was, sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn. She stood as soon as she saw me, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Ethan, she began, her voice trembling. I interrupted, holding up a hand. Not yet. I need to say something first. She nodded, her eyes wide with fear and guilt. I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath, steadying myself. If you want to fix this, if there's even a chance, you need to tell me the truth. All of it. No more lies, no more excuses. I deserve that much. She hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. For a moment, I thought she might try to deflect or deny. But then she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Okay, I'll tell you everything. She sat back down, and I took a seat across from her, my arms crossed as I waited. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her hands trembling in her lap. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes glistening with tears. It started a few months ago, she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen, Ethan. I swear. James was he was there. We worked late a lot, and he listened when I felt overwhelmed. It was stupid, and it never should have happened. I clenched my jaw, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. So what? You just decided that talking wasn't enough? You had to take it further? Her shoulders shook as she sobbed. It wasn't like that. I didn't plan for it. It just happened. I shook my head, my voice cold. That's not good enough, Lisa. You don't accidentally betray your husband. You made a choice. And now, we're both paying for it. She nodded, her tears falling freely. I know I've destroyed everything. But I love you, Ethan. I never stopped loving you. I let out a bitter laugh. You have a funny way of showing it. Silence hung between us, heavy and oppressive. I wanted to yell, to scream, to demand answers that would somehow make sense of all this. But deep down, I knew there were no answers that could undo the damage. The trust we'd built, the life we'd shared. It was shattered, and no amount of apologies could put it back together. Finally, I stood, my chest tight with emotion. I need time, Lisa. I can't make any decisions right now, but I'm not sure if I can forgive this, or if I even want to. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't stay to comfort her. Instead, I walked upstairs to the guest room and closed the door behind me. For now, that was all I could do. Create distance and try to figure out what came next. Whatever that was, one thing was clear. Nothing would ever be the same. The guest room felt unfamiliar and cold. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall, the silence in the house pressing down on me like a weight. Lisa's muffled sobs drifted up from downstairs, but I didn't feel any urge to comfort her. I was too drained, too angry, and too lost to offer anything. As the minutes turned into hours, I replayed everything in my mind. The late nights, the excuses, the photo, her confession. It was like trying to piece together a puzzle I didn't want to complete. Every memory felt tainted now, every shared moment overshadowed by her betrayal. Eventually, I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. My body was exhausted, but my mind refused to quiet. I thought about the life we'd built together, the promises we'd made, and the version of Lisa I thought I knew. I'd loved her deeply, completely. I trusted her with everything. And now? Now I didn't know if I even recognized her. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. I stayed in the guest room until I heard the door close, signaling Lisa had left for work. It felt easier this way, avoiding her, delaying the inevitable conversations we'd have to have. I needed space, time to process everything without her presence clouding my thoughts. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but my mind kept drifting back to her words from the night before. I love you, Ethan. I never stopped loving you. What did that even mean? How could she claim to love me while betraying me so completely? Was it guilt that made her say it? Desperation? Or did she actually believe it? By the time Lisa came home that evening, I still hadn't found any answers. She hesitated in the doorway, her keys jangling in her hand. "Hi," she said softly, her voice tentative. I glanced up from the couch, where I'd been pretending to watch TV. "Hi." She set her bag down and stood there for a moment, as if waiting for permission to speak. Finally, she sat down in the chair across from me, her hands folded in her lap. I know you don't want to talk, but I just want you to know I'm sorry. For everything." I turned off the TV and looked at her, my expression unreadable. "Do you even know what you're sorry for, Lisa? Or are you just sorry you got caught?" Her face crumpled, and tears filled her eyes again. "I'm sorry for hurting you, for breaking your trust, for being so selfish and stupid. I don't know how to make it right, Ethan, but I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes." I studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity, but all I saw was a broken woman, desperate to fix what she'd shattered. "It's not that simple," I said finally. "You can't just say you're sorry and expect everything to go back to normal. This isn't something you can undo." "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling, "but I love you, Ethan. I don't want to lose you." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "You already lost me, Lisa. The moment you decided to lie to me, to betray me, you lost me." Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. I felt a pang of something, maybe sympathy, maybe anger. I wasn't sure. All I knew was that the woman sitting across from me was no longer the person I thought I'd married. That night, I returned to the guest room, leaving Lisa to her thoughts. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling once again, I realized I was no closer to making a decision than I had been the night before. Part of me wanted to leave, to walk away from the pain and betrayal and start fresh. But another part of me, a smaller, quieter part, wondered if there was still something worth salvaging. Could we rebuild? Could I ever trust her again? Did I even want to try? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in this limbo forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to make a choice. The days that followed were agonizingly slow. Lisa and I existed in the same house, but it felt like we were living on different planets. Every conversation was brief, every interaction awkward. She was trying, that much was clear. She offered to make my favorite meals, asked if I needed anything, and gave me space when I didn't respond. But no amount of effort could erase what had happened. For me, the mornings were the hardest. Waking up in the guest room, knowing Lisa was just down the hall, reminded me every day of how far we'd fallen. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it was emotional, and it felt insurmountable. I threw myself into work, hoping the routine would distract me, but even that failed. My thoughts constantly drifted back to her. Not the Lisa sitting quietly downstairs, trying to make amends, but the Lisa I'd married. The woman who laughed at my terrible jokes, who danced with me in the kitchen, who made me believe we had something unbreakable. Where had that woman gone? Or had I just been blind to who she really was all along? One evening, after another day of avoidance, Lisa finally broke the silence. I was sitting in the living room, staring blankly at the TV, when she walked in. Her movements were hesitant, almost timid, as she sat down on the edge of the couch. Ethan, she began, her voice soft but steady. I know I've already said this, but I need you to hear me. I'm so sorry for what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know how much I regret it. I didn't respond right away, letting her words hang in the air. She waited, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes pleading with me to say something. Anything. Why? I asked finally, my voice colder than I intended. Why did you do it, Lisa? Was I not enough for you? Did I fail you somehow? Her eyes widened, and she shook her head quickly. No, Ethan, it wasn't like that. You didn't fail me. You've always been more than enough. This was about me, not you. Then explain it to me, I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. Help me understand how you could throw away everything we built for. What? A fling? Attention? What was it, Lisa? She looked down, her tears falling silently onto her hands. I was stupid, she whispered. I felt lost, like I wasn't good enough. James was there, and he made me feel wanted. But it was a mistake, Ethan. The biggest mistake of my life. Her words cut deep, but they didn't bring the clarity I was hoping for. Instead, they left me feeling even more confused. How could she claim to love me, to value our marriage, while turning to someone else? It didn't make sense. It would never make sense. I don't know if I can do this, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. Her sobs grew louder, but she didn't try to defend herself. For once, she just sat there, letting the weight of her actions sink in. I stood, my chest tight, and walked past her without another word. I needed to be anywhere but there. I ended up at the park near our house, the one we used to visit on lazy Sunday afternoons. The swings creaked in the breeze, and the distant sound of kids playing reminded me of simpler times. I sat on a bench, staring out at the empty playground, and tried to make sense of my feelings. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to believe that we could rebuild what we'd lost. But another part of me, a louder, angrier part, knew that forgiveness wouldn't come easily, if at all. Trust wasn't something you could patch up overnight, and even if I wanted to try, I wasn't sure Lisa was worth the effort anymore. The thought made my chest ache, but it also brought a strange sense of clarity. Maybe this was the end. Maybe some things couldn't be fixed, no matter how hard you tried. When I returned home, the house was dark and quiet. Lisa had gone to bed, leaving me alone with my thoughts once again. As I stood in the doorway of the guest room, I made a decision. Tomorrow, I would tell her how I felt. Everything. I couldn't keep living in this limbo, trapped between anger and heartbreak. It was time to move forward, one way or another. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of resolve. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was clarity. The pain was still there, sharp and unrelenting. But I knew I couldn't stay in this state of limbo any longer. Lisa and I needed to have a final conversation, one that would decide the future of our marriage. I found her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. When she saw me, she straightened slightly, as if bracing herself for whatever was about to come. Lisa, I began, my voice steady but firm. We need to talk. She nodded, setting her cup down and folding her hands in her lap. Okay. I sat across from her, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, I didn't know where to start. How do you put into words the depth of your pain, the weight of your disappointment? Finally, I took a deep breath and spoke. I've been thinking a lot about everything, I said. About us, about what you did, and about what it means for our future. And the truth is, I don't think I can move past this. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't interrupt. She just nodded, her lips trembling as she waited for me to continue. I trusted you, Lisa. I believed in you. And you took that trust and destroyed it. I can't forget that, and I don't think I can forgive it. Not now, and maybe not ever. The tears spilled over, and she covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I waited, letting her process what I'd said, before continuing. I'll always care about you, I admitted, my voice softening slightly. But this is too much. I can't live in a marriage where I'm constantly questioning everything, where I don't feel secure or respected. That's not fair to me, and it's not fair to you either. She looked up at me then, her face streaked with tears. Ethan, I know I've hurt you more than I can ever fix, but I love you. I never stopped loving you. Please, don't give up on us. Her words were sincere, but they weren't enough. They couldn't undo the damage or erase the betrayal. I shook my head slowly, my chest tight. Sometimes love isn't enough, Lisa. Sometimes the damage is too great. Her sobs grew louder, but I stayed firm. I'd made my decision, and I wasn't going to let her tears sway me. This wasn't about punishing her. It was about protecting myself, about finding a way to move forward, even if it meant doing it alone. Over the next few weeks, we began the process of separating. It was painful, messy, and filled with moments of doubt, but it was also necessary. Lisa moved out of the house, and for the first time in years, I found myself alone. The silence was deafening at first, but eventually, it became a source of solace. I focused on rebuilding my life, one step at a time. It wasn't easy, but with every passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like myself. I started spending more time with friends, rediscovering hobbies I'd long neglected, and even exploring the possibility of therapy to help me process everything. As for Lisa, I don't know where her path led. We kept things civil for the sake of tying up loose ends, but beyond that, our lives drifted apart. I hope she found the peace she was searching for, just as I was learning to find mine. Looking back now, I realized that her betrayal, as devastating as it was, didn't define me. It was a chapter in my life, not the whole story. And while it left scars, it also taught me valuable lessons about love, trust, and the importance of knowing your own worth. Sometimes, endings are inevitable, but they also make way for new beginnings. And for the first time in a long time, I'm ready to embrace whatever comes next. Bye.